So remember how a couple weeks ago Epic was like Fortnite's gonna be back on the iPhone next week? Well, that still hasn't happened. It's Sunday, so let's get sensational. I'm Mike and I'm back to talk about the gaming news. Just like Giant Bomb is back. So before we hop into the news about Epic versus Apple, I'm going to briefly talk about Giant Bomb. I covered the story about how Giant Bomb staff had a falling out with the company that owns them, Fandom, a few weeks ago over journalistic interference, and most of the people that worked for the site ended up walking out. Well, they had several meetings with Fandom, and Fandom agreed to let them buy Giant Bomb. So Giant Bomb is back and now independently owned by Jeff Baclar, Jeff Grubb, Dan Reichert, Jan Ochoa, and Mike Minotti. They're still getting stuff figured out over there, but from my personal standpoint, as someone who's followed this site since 2008, I'm just glad that it gets to continue. But while Giant Bomb is back, a certain game is still not back on the iPhone. So if you missed the story from a couple weeks ago, Apple was back in court with Epic, and the courts told Apple basically like, y'all gotta allow third-party links to payment methods in the apps, and you can't put up warning screens to discourage people from using the third-party payment methods. And they also told them they can't take commission on any of those payments, for now at least, because Apple is appealing the decision and they're going to be in court forever and ever. But because of the current ruling, Epic was like, cool, we're going to put Fortnite back on the iPhone since Apple can't collect any money from it if we use our own payment method. So Epic submitted Fortnite to the US App Store several times, but basically they didn't hear anything back from Apple. The way the process works for most app stores is you have to submit an app, and the company that owns the app store will either approve it or they'll deny it and give a reason for the denial. But in Epic's case, they just didn't hear anything. They also included the EU version of the app along with their submission for the US version, so that version was also stuck in limbo. So with their submission stuck in limbo, and Apple basically saying nothing, there wasn't much for Epic to do aside from have their CEO get petty on Twitter and suggest people go download a blatant Fortnite ripoff that's supported by ads, because apparently Apple approved that, but not actual Fortnite. So eventually Apple did address the whole situation, and they said that they are in fact not blocking Fortnite from the App Store in the EU. Basically, Apple said they're holding off on approving Fortnite because they're asking for a partial stay on the court's decision, aka Apple's asking the courts to hold on making them enforce these new rules, and they don't want to approve Fortnite for the App Store until their stay is heard by the courts. For the EU version of the game, they told Epic to do a separate submission, since the reason that the EU version was held up was because it was submitted along with the US version that they don't want to approve right now. Epic Games then responded on Twitter asking the courts to basically force Apple to accept their submission. So yeah, in case you were wondering if Fortnite is back on the App Store or if either company was done being petty, the answer is no.
To which one?
Yes. Just like Sony may soon be saying yes to a PS5 price increase. So we talked about the big price increase across the Xbox line a few weeks ago, and a week before that, Sony raised prices of the PS5 in a few regions outside of the US, but they hadn't really mentioned anything about raising the prices in the US. Well, Sony addressed the US prices after a recent earnings report, so right now Sony is estimating that they have around 3 months worth of PS5s already in the US. So since these consoles are already in the country, they're obviously not going to be subject to import tariffs, which buys them some time before they have to make a decision on the price. Now, Sony confirmed that most PS5s are currently made in China, which is temporarily under a 35% tariff rate, which, like everything else with the tariffs, is subject to change by the second. Now, what Sony officially said after the earnings report was, it's a possibility that the cost would be passed on to the customer for the tariffs, aka we'd be paying more. And their CEO, Hiroki Totoki, also mentioned manufacturing some of their consoles in the US as a possibility to get around the tariffs. But I feel like that would take way longer than the time frame they have, aka the 3 months until they potentially run out of consoles in the US. So it looks like in the short term, at least for a few months, the PS5 price probably won't change in the US, but after that, there's a good chance that we'll see an increase. And Sony's not alone. Obviously, Xbox already raised prices, and Nintendo basically has come out and said that the price of the Switch 2 is staying the same for now, but they said that the profit margin for the Switch 2 is already lower than the original Switch, and that they will be monitoring the tariff situation to make adjustments if they need to. Which at this point, monitoring the tariffs, it's its own full 24-hour-a-day job. You need at least 3 people on retainer who are just constantly awake just to keep track of everything that's going on. But either way, it looks like we might see some changes in the prices of the PS5 and possibly the Switch 2. And speaking of changes and Nintendo, some of the specs for the Switch 2 have changed, and not for the better. So let's go ahead and talk about it today. And our final story. So one of the features I was personally excited about for the Switch 2 was VRR, or variable refresh rate. It basically syncs the screen's refresh rate with the frame rate that the game is running at, and it can really make gameplay feel a lot smoother on games with inconsistent frame rates. And when Nintendo announced the Switch 2, it was one of the features that they put front and center. But now that's changed. So VRR is still coming to the Switch 2, but only in handheld mode. Nintendo has removed the mention of VRR support in docked mode, aka over HDMI, and the story started to pick up steam after Digital Foundry noticed that they had removed wording about the feature from their website. And eventually Nintendo came out and addressed the whole thing, and they said they made a mistake saying that VRR would be supported in docked mode. They were also asked if they would be adding the feature in the future, but they said they had no further comment as of right now. So yes, the internal screen will support VRR, but not the connection from the dock to the TV or monitors. And to be honest, I don't think it's that big of a deal for most people. I'm one of the few people, at least in my personal life, that even has a TV that has VRR and supports 120 Hertz. But most people that I know don't. And even if they do, they're probably not even aware of that feature. So I think for most Switch 2 buyers, they probably won't even notice that the feature is gone. Now, personally, I am disappointed. I was kind of looking forward to that feature, but it's not really a deal breaker even for me. Now, with the facts out of the way, it's time for my personal conspiracy theory. So right now, Nintendo specs don't confirm which HDMI standard the HDMI port on the dock uses. I'm not going deep into HDMI standards because it's a mess, but basically standard VRR support was introduced with HDMI 2.1, which is still fairly new for an HDMI standard. At least it's actually not that new. But along with standardized VRR support, HDMI 2.1 also supports 4K 120 Hertz. And the reason I mention this is because the Switch 2 only supports 4K 60 Hz or 120 Hz at 1080p or 1440p. So my big conspiracy theory, based on the fact that it doesn't do 4K 120 docked and that they're saying that it can't do VRR now, is that they're probably using HDMI 2.0 in the dock. Now, that's not a fact because, again, HDMI standards are kind of a mess, and it doesn't have to support everything that's part of HDMI 2.1 to be an HDMI 2.1 port. So I could be completely wrong, but being that it's missing two big features of HDMI 2.1 with the 4K 120 Hz and now VRR, it may just be the case that it's HDMI 2.0. Now, if that's the case, I'm wondering if Nintendo would allow third-party docks with HDMI 2.1 ports to use that feature. I'm guessing not, because they would probably have it disabled in software as well. But either way, it's kind of a weird situation that they said it had the feature and then had to turn around and remove it from all their marketing because it doesn't. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you care at all that the Switch 2 is not going to have VRR support when it's docked? Again, let me know down below. And if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to tell a friend, tell a coworker, like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell notification button thing to be notified when I drop a video or a live stream. And always do at least two things at the same time.